Good afternoon, everyone. We are almost halfway through our day today. It's been a good day. We've had one main stage, we've had two master classes, and now we have Dr. Dana Lyles from Global Ministries, and she is here. She is going to be presenting with us. Let me just say this. One of the programs that I know that is a part of her portfolio is the Community Developers Program. And I know that there are 41 programs throughout the continental US and
Yes.
possibly more internationally that have been started. And this is important to us during this time and for this day, for this reason. Minding our spiritual business and sacred duties includes how we move beyond our walls. Dr. Cedric, let me turn to you for just a moment before we give it over to Dr. Lyles. How important is this going to be for us as we move into the future, understanding how we connect with the community, how we forge partnerships, collaboration? Jasmine Smith shared with us before we left our masterclass that we have to not only understand partnerships, but also understand alliances. And so let me give it to you for about 2 minutes before we turn it over to Dr. Lyles.
Yeah, this just picks up, and thank you, Dana, for being here and sharing in this. This just picks up from the piece where Dr. Lewis shared in the masterclass around pivoting. As we look at our community engagement, it's about learning who we are and who will come along with us, right? And who will we go along with? What is it that binds us together? What is it that's calling us forth, calling us out of our buildings? COVID called us out of our buildings. What else will call us out of our buildings? And more than that, what will keep us out of our buildings, or what will allow us to open them up and reimagine how we are present in our communities and how we engage those in these key partnerships that this time has brought before us.
Dr. Lyles, before you began, one of the things that we asked in our master class was how were the participants feeling today? How did this feel for them, this type of virtual event? And the vast majority said it felt good. They did not have to travel. They did not have to get a hotel. Now, we miss the connection in terms of being in person, but they appreciated the fact that they could weave this into their schedule, that they could participate and learn so much more about what they need to know as we move forward. So we are so looking forward to your component now, because you're going to be talking about how we connect and how we engage our communities. And so again, let me just welcome you and thank you on behalf of the Virginia Conference, on behalf of our planning team, and we are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Daniels. Good afternoon, Virginia Annual Conference family. I am Dr. Dana Lyles, where I joyfully serve as the director and team lead of the Multi-Ethnic Ministries Unit at the General Board of Global Ministries in Atlanta, Georgia. I am so thankful for technology. I'm currently in Kentucky this week, doing mission in the field and spending time with family, and I am thankful for this online platform that I am able to join you virtually in the state of Virginia. On behalf of our General Secretary, Roland Fernandez, and my colleagues and missionaries from around the world, I bring you greetings from GBGM. Today, I'm privileged to talk about a topic that's so near and dear to my heart: community engagement and development. So many churches are actively participating in activities within their local communities, and I want us to go deeper and be more intentional with our interactions with the community. If you will just bear with me for a moment. So paragraph 120 of our United Methodist Book of Discipline states, the mission of the church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Local churches and extension ministries of the church provide the most significant arenas through which disciple making occurs. Our book of discipline is calling us to move beyond the walls of our church and be engaged with those in our communities. And I want to take a couple of seconds right now and ask you to type in the chat how God is calling you to move beyond the walls in your local community. So again, I'm asking if you will share with you how God is calling you to interact and engage with your community beyond your church walls. Dwayne and Dr. Daniels, I'm unable to see anything in the chat. Are y'all able to see anything in the chat?
I'm not seeing anything come in.
Okay.
Okay, food pantry and transitional housing is what Siri just typed.
Okay. Are there others? So delivering meals and helping others with difficult tasks. That's very important.
Mr. Brown, we see you. Do you have something you want to say? Mr. Brown raised his hand, but he's muted.
Hey, so during and after school care for children with parents who have to work. So these are all wonderful examples of how we are being called to be in ministry with our local communities. So before we jump into engaging in the community, we must do some internal work first. I want you to look at your own church. Is your church a faith community or is it a social club? A social club is a group of people or a place where they meet, generally formed around a common interest, occupation, or activity. Usually with a social club, there is little to no engagement with those outside of the social club. And oftentimes the members of a social club, they contribute financially. But I must admit, it was very hard for me to find a good definition of what a faith community is. And I found these 5 bullet points on the website of a non-denominational church, and it really spoke to me about what a faith community is. Not only is the church working internally to address the spiritual needs of the members through worship and small groups, but this church is actively serving in the local community through partnerships and programs. So I ask you today, is your local congregation functioning as a social club or is it functioning as a faith community? Are you having regular meetings, which are really our weekly worship services? Are the members contributing financially through their tithes and offerings? Is your church engaged with the community outside of the church walls on a regular basis? I ask these questions not to pass judgment on your local congregation, but we must be honest with ourselves with where we currently stand in our local context. Ed Setzer, he is a professor and dean at the Wheaton College. And Setzer is a church planter, and he's revitalized and pastored churches and trained pastors and church planters from across the world. And he has a heart for churches engaging in mission and ministry outside of the church. And Dr. Setzer states that churches that are making a difference engage people in ministry within the church and mission outside of the church. There has to be both an inner ministry and an outward facing ministry for a church to truly make a difference in their local community. So let's look at the ministry of Jesus. Not only did Jesus preach in the temples, but Jesus taught through his interactions with those on the margins and was actively engaged in ministry opportunities with them. The people on the margins began to know who he was, and through his ministry, they began to follow him. Jesus did not make a big deal about himself when he was engaging with the people. So as we seek to work in our local communities, what is your purpose? What are the changes you seek to make within your local community? Or is your church looking for exposure in the press and the larger community? While this question may seem very harsh to ask, it is a very important question because sometimes churches and organizations are engaged in activities and ministries that are harmful and exploitive to communities in which they are interacting with or engaging with. So let's take a look at community engagement and community outreach. These two terms are used interchangeably, but they are really not the same thing. I want you to think about your church setting. How many of your churches set up boxes each August and September for a school supply drive, or your church has a beautifully decorated Christmas tree in November and December, adorned with angel tags to support families in need during the holiday season? These are examples of community outreach with those in need. When the community outreach occurs, goods and services and products are given to those in need within our local context, but usually there is little to no benefit or long-term benefit to the local community and congregation. Community engagement, on the other hand, is a long-term activity that involves partnerships and coalitions that help mobilize resources and help influence systems and practices and change relationships among partners and serve as a catalyst to help change policies, programs, and practices. Community engagement helps improve the health of the community and its members. If you think back to the 1950s and 60s, community engagement was used extensively during the civil rights movement as churches served as a community hub for meetings, learning opportunities, and mobilization efforts. The civil rights movement was led by pastors and congregations seeking to make a change in our laws for African-American citizens. And this movement was not for a few weeks or months or days, but it happened over the course of years. And it took a long-term commitment from congregations to remain engaged in the movement for change to occur. The best way to differentiate between community outreach and community engagement is that community outreach activities are for people in the community, and engagement happens with activities with people seeking to make a long-term change. Community engagement requires time, energy, and resources. And when I'm meeting with congregations and annual conferences across this connection, the first question that is always asked of me is, where do we start? So these 7 questions that are on your screen are not the holy grail of beginning community engagement work. And I must admit, there are a lot of subpoints that come under each of these points. But I have found that these 7 steps gently move churches into action. The first step when I'm meeting with churches and annual conferences is that I ask that they prepare themselves spiritually. I cannot underscore how important this is to spiritually prepare yourself before engaging in ministry beyond the church walls. I ask congregations to pray individually and corporately if what they seek to do has truly been discerned through prayer. Oftentimes we get a vision or idea, but it's really not what God is calling us to do in this season. And we may end up doing more harm than good in our local communities and with our neighbors. Each time I meet with a congregation or I'm meeting with the annual conference, I pray. And I pray for guidance for God to lead us in the way and in the manner He seeks us to do in the local community. And I ask God to lay it upon our hearts, the mission and the ministry that is needed in this community and in the local context. And that this work is not about us, but it's truly about God and the uplifting of God's kingdom. So I ask you, how will you prepare yourself spiritually to do the work that you seek to do in your community? And feel free to share in the chat box as we are talking today. But before we move forward, I do take a step back and define what community is. There are so many definitions of what a community is, but for the purpose of the work that we do at Global Ministries, we define a community as a group of individuals that are living in the same space or having a particular characteristic in common. No two communities are the same, and we must give honor to the distinct characteristics of communities in which we are engaging in. And quite frankly, a community can be very complex and it can be very messy. And many sub-communities are within the context of a local, larger community. The third step in getting to know the community, the third step in engaging in the community is getting to know the community surrounding the church. This is a very important step because we as humans make so many assumptions about the people, the building, the resources, or the lack thereof that a community has. But there are local assets within a community that we oftentimes do not see. We have quite honestly been trained to look at communities and situations that we deem quote unquote less than us from a glass half empty mindset. We have been inherently conditioned, whether we want to admit it or not, that communities, particularly low income communities and majority minority communities, are full of needs and deficiencies, and it is our job to go in and save them from themselves. In reality, those same communities are full with assets and capacities that have been unable to be realized due to financial or systematic constraints. So I want you to look at this neighborhood. This is a neighborhood map that is highlighting the deficiencies of this community. It's highlighting the unemployment, educational challenges within the community, as well as housing challenges and socioeconomic issues. This map is highlighting all of what is wrong with this local community. Now I want you to look on your screen, same community, but through a glass half full lens. This neighborhood is highlighting the assets and potential of the community. As congregations, we must look at communities through a glass half full approach to realize the potential that our local communities offer. Oftentimes, there are assets that we can't see that are right in front of our faces and our eyes that are just waiting to be tapped and utilized for the building and uplifting of our local communities. Another step that's key in community engagement is listening and learning. And this is very critical because from our lens going into the communities, oftentimes we think that we know what a community needs without listening or talking with our community members. And through our lack of listening, we can cause harm to communities that are already in precarious situations. And we are able to hear what communities truly need and what their desires and wants are. This book on the screen, Having Nothing and Possessing Everything, was written by Reverend Michael Mather, who is an ordained elder in the Mountain Sky Annual Conference, currently serving in Boulder, Colorado. And this book chronicles his ministry in Indianapolis, Indiana at Broadway United Methodist Church. And Broadway was very intentional in how they listened to their neighbors in their community. Their church was a site that would distribute food from the government to recipients, and recipients were asked to disclose their income. One of these recipients asked Pastor Mike why the church only asked how poor people were, but didn't ask them any other questions. And this question by one of the local community members took Mike aback, because they never thought that they were asking someone how poor they were by asking their financial income situation. So the church pivoted. While they were required to still ask about a recipient's financial status or financial income, they added 3 questions to the form that was filled out by each recipient. First question was, what 3 things do you do well enough that you could teach them to someone else? Second question, what 3 things would you like to learn that you already don't know? And then 3, who besides God is going to go with you along the way? While these are 3 simple questions, these 3 questions helped pivot a community in which they were able to highlight community members' assets and aspirations. And this church was able to connect community members with others who had skills and the knowledge base that other community members needed or wanted to learn. And what Broadway saw was a shift in their local community and a shift in the program they did as a church to help the community members become entrepreneurs and mentors. And the community members took ownership of the community's transformation. And in one story that is told in the book, there was a particular community member who would come in and receive food every week. And through these 3 questions, they learned that she was an entrepreneur and she was a cook. But due to financial constraints, she did not have access to be a true entrepreneur. So she was asked by the church to come in and cater a meal for a meeting that was occurring for local business owners and leaders within the Indianapolis community. And through this chance meeting and through this chance opportunity to cater to the business leaders and opportunities, she found investors who were willing to invest in her restaurant. And she was able to become a successful entrepreneur in the greater Indianapolis area. As you know, last year was a year like no other, and we were, and we still are, fighting the pandemic of racism and COVID-19 at the same time. Last year, the Office of Multi-Ethnic Ministries at GBGM, we offered grants to annual conferences to specifically be used in cities that were heavily impacted by police-involved shootings. In Louisville, where the city was reeling from the shooting of Breonna Taylor, what was being overlooked were the unknowns of the pandemic, coupled with schools shutting down indefinitely and children being afraid of the police. And this was impacting students well beyond what we knew as adults. So we asked the annual conference to go into the communities and ask them what they really needed. The community, not only did they need our prayers and supports, but they really needed in that season was mental health support and academic support for students. So as a result, churches in the Louisville area came together to offer mental art therapy support and academic support to students last summer to deal with a potential learning loss and the abrupt changes that happened in their lives. In Minneapolis, after the George Floyd shooting and the acts of violence around the Cup Foods area, that local neighborhood was left without access to food and medication. Furthermore, the citizens also needed mental health support. So we asked the churches to go into that local community and ask them, what do you need from us? Again, it was easy to make assumptions from the outside looking in what the community needed, but we wanted to be very intentional with our ministry with them, that we were honoring what they needed in that season. Again, these neighbors needed our support through food and access to medication. And we were able to bring in culturally relevant and responsive mental health therapists to help them in this season. This was a need when we were looking from the outside in of mental health support that would not have been thought about if churches had not talked and actively listened to the community members. Building authentic relationships is something that you must do with your local communities, in which it means that we're walking in solidarity with our community members, and we're not giving to our community members. Authentic relationships are not transactional, but it requires us to walk alongside one another. In building the authentic relationships in the communities that we serve in, we're not only giving the community members a voice, but we're giving them an invitation to walk alongside us as equals. Oftentimes, organizations and churches go into a community and do not work with community neighbors as equals, and there's usually a power dynamic in which we are going in to help the oppressed. But for true engagement to work, there must be a level playing field in terms of power. Within our community developers program, which I'll talk about a little bit more later at GBGM, it's required that our congregations that are engaging in community development work create a committee of at least 50% church members and 50% community members that are not members of the church. So there is transparency and there is an equal power dynamic within the power structure. And walking in solidarity within building authentic relationships, it creates an air of transparency between the church and the local communities. So I want you to think about your local congregation. How many of your churches have food programs or pantries where community members come to the church and pick up food or prepackaged boxes of food? A great way to engage in your community is through turning your existing ministries outward. My local church in Atlanta, Impact Church, not only has a food distribution each week on its campus, but boxes are loaded into our church vans and into the trunks and cars of our church members. And they are taken into communities in which we have established partnerships with to give to members of the community who don't have access to transportation or have mobility issues. So we at Impact were able to turn our existing ministry from being an on-site ministry of food delivery and food distribution to one that services multiple neighborhoods and communities within the larger East Point community. Reaching out through community events is a great way for churches to begin its journey into community outreach and engagement. In Atlanta, and is the same across the United States, access to COVID-19 testing and vaccines have been a barrier to residents of Black and Brown communities. So our church actually partnered with the Fulton County Health Department to provide weekly COVID-19 tests and vaccines to community members. And our church actually expanded its COVID testing to happen during our weekly drive-in worship service at 10 a.m. So we were able to increase our church worship attendance, as well as provide a very needed service to our local communities. Also, as churches, we can play pivotal roles in providing space for educational forums and information sessions with local school districts. As a former school administrator, our school would partner with local congregations and community partners that educational sessions in our local communities. The school I served largely had a big immigrant population, and we found that there were transportation barriers to our local schools. So we would partner with congregations within the local communities to provide critical information and access to information to our families who otherwise will not have access to information. While these steps that I laid out will not be the end all or be all while engaging in your community, this is a beginning step to community engagement. Community engagement is not something that happens overnight, but it takes prayer and discernment and intentionality to be successful and to be done without harm. Dr. Stetzer said that there should be a difference in the community because the church exists. And if it left for some reason, there should be a void that's left. So if your church made the decision to shutter its doors tomorrow after the Sunday service, what would the impact in the community be? Would your community even know that the church left? Would the church be devastated by this void that is now there? If your community would not even know that your church shuttered its doors, your church has work to do as we are called to be in ministry with our neighbors and beyond the walls of our church. Now I want to talk about the Developers Program that is housed at Global Ministries. We are a network of racial, ethnic, and community congregations and communities throughout the United States, engaging in work around advocacy, health support, education support, and providing affordable housing and access to healthcare across the United States. We have CDP sites in 16 states in all 5 jurisdictions, including Norfolk, UMC, and the Virginia Annual Conference. And we are so thankful to Dr. Daniels and the ministry that Norfolk is doing within the Norfolk community. And without our CDP sites, there would be huge voids within our racial and ethnic communities. I want to highlight a couple of our CDP sites across the United States. On your screen is the Emory Fellowship Beacon of Light in Washington, DC. As we all know, access to housing is becoming a huge barrier as prices are going up and gentrification is occurring. In the neighborhood in which Emory Fellowship sits, they realized that local community members were being priced out of affordable housing. So Emory Fellowship built 99 units of affordable housing around the perimeter of the church to provide affordable housing to its neighbors. Not only do they provide affordable housing to neighbors, they have retail space to potentially rent out space for stores and restaurants to help increase the economy of that local community. And not only were they thinking about their local community, but they thought about their larger community, because on the western side of the perimeter of their property is a battlefield, which is maintained by the National Park Services. And when visitors were coming to visit this battlefield, there was not a place for visitors to use the restroom. So Emory built to their new property and new structure, an office for the National Park Services, not only for a staff person, but for a restroom area for visitors visiting the battlefield. And they are renting this space for $1 a month to the national government as a service to the community. Another site that I want to highlight is the Better Community Development Incorporated in Little Rock, Arkansas with the Teresa Hoover United Methodist Church. This church has comprehensive healthcare services, as well as provides services to veterans, and is very active in criminal and prison reform. Through the partnerships that Better Community Development has established, not only locally, but with the state and nationwide, they are able to accept insurance for its medical services to help those in need. And I would be remiss to also to leave out that they do also have transitional housing that is offered to veterans and those returning from addiction rehabilitation. So as I wrap up, I say this to all of the churches and annual conferences that seek to engage in community development. Rome was not built in a day, and community engagement and development won't be either. This work is messy, it's tiring, and you won't always get it right. but I implore you to correct your mistakes and just keep going. And the end result will be priceless because you are impacting and making changes within a larger community. And I ask you to just keep going, make a change within your local community. Thank you for joining me today. It has been a joy. If you have any questions, I ask you to type them in the chat box or the Q&A. We will use the remainder of our time to dialogue with one another.
Amen. Dr. Lyles, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And just leave that slide for just a second. Dr. Bridgeforth is on with me. You say Rome wasn't built in a day?
Rome wasn't built in a day.
Well, you know what? Rome wasn't even built in 15 years.
Was not.
I can tell you that. But I think that every day that we put forth the effort is worth what we're doing in the full life of the community. And I think the beauty of Global Ministries and your office and the work that you're doing is that you all push us beyond our walls. And
Absolutely.
you not only push us, but you also provide the necessary resources. So I'm going to ask you to take us out of your screen share and go back into our gallery view. And that way we can kind of entertain the questions and answers. Well,
We have
that people have.
We have one question here from Ms. Witten, which is to repeat your 7th step. What brings about community resistance and where have you found ways to overcome when relationship building is stalled or another sees your work as going against their own church?
So step number 7 is referring to, I want to make sure I get it right. My step 7 is reaching out through community events. So I'm not sure is that lining up with?
Can you ask it again, Dwayne?
That was, it may have been a 2-part question. She said, please repeat your 7th step.
Okay.
And then she asked, what brings about community resistance? And where have you found ways to overcome when relationship building gets stalled because people feel like you're focusing out? I'm interpreting, but I believe it's asking, are there times when churches feel like all of that outward focus means you're neglecting them? And how do you address that?
Okay, so step number 7 was reaching out through community events with the local community. And to answer the question about where have I found it when we have seen it stalled, what I have seen is that to overcome that, it was usually a lack of transparency. Again, churches going in to the community and not truly articulating what their true intention was. Quite honestly, when we're trying to work with communities, there is a lot of apprehension because 9 times out of 10, you're not the first group that's coming in seeking to be in partnership or a relationship with that community. And a lot of times people will come in, do the activities, take the pictures for social media or for the press, and then they leave and never come back. Mm-hmm. And so have become jaded because they're looking at you as you're just coming in for a photo op, but aren't seeking to make a true change within the local community. So yes, there will be stalling and there will be resistance because people have been burned in the past. But it takes the intentionality and the continuity of you making the effort within the community and transparency for you to move beyond those roadblocks.
And I believe I misunderstood the question, so I'm going to actually give Ms. Witten a chance to ask it in her own words. Here you go, Ms. Witten. I'm allowing you to talk.
The answer was very helpful. Part of the question was not about people within the church that you're working with, but that you go to reach out and make partnerships and alliances in the community, and you're speaking to someone from a different congregation and denomination who you can't seem to enable for connection, so that you can attempt to make that alliance or that partnership occur. And I never have been able to understand what that was about, other than the way faith has been taught. So I'm wondering if you've ever run into something like that, where there was understanding what was going on.
Yes. And so with those churches that have been seeking to make those partnerships and it doesn't work, we just tell them to move on. Because at the end of the day, we don't have time to beg people to do this work. And it's very sad that, you know, we have churches within our denomination who say that they want to go out and be engaged in their community, but when the opportunity truly exists, they're not moving forward. So we just tell churches, if you're, you know, interacting and encountering resistance, just keep moving forward without them.
Mhm. Dr. Lyles, we have another question that goes right in line with that. It says, when you are in a cross-cultural appointment and you participate in a community event, such as Black Lives Matter, your church resists. Shed some light on how to handle it. Now, you've answered that in part, but I know in light of everything that has gone on over this past year, there are probably some other things that we need to say to our faith communities. One thing that I would say is we need to educate our congregations so that they can fully understand what is being represented. Because I know that the media and other folk have ways of, crafting their narrative that will not allow people to see what is fully intended by a particular movement. So can you add some light to that, especially when you're in a cross-cultural appointment? Because I think it is so important for us to be able to have that conversation. I think it was Bishop Sharon Brown Christopher who overly emphasized that regardless of what we do, we have to keep all of the voices at the table. So can you shed some light on that before we have to transition?
Yes. So in everything that I say, especially around Black Lives Matter, I always differentiate. There is Black Lives Matter, the organization, and Black Lives Matter, the human rights issue. And when we are talking about Black Lives Matter, we are talking about the human rights issue. That Black people we are not treated fairly. We are subjected to systematic racism. We have policies and procedures that stack policies against us as citizens of this United States of America. And the work that we are doing around Black Lives Matter is a humanitarian mission, a humanitarian ministry, and humanitarian work. We are not saying that Black lives matter more than our white brothers and sisters, or our Asian brothers and sisters, or our Pacific Islander and Native American brothers and sisters. But we have seen time and time again, and especially within this past year, that incidents and occurrences are happening which Black lives are under attack. So I always make sure that I reiterate that when we are saying Black Lives Matter, we are coming from a standpoint of humanitarian ministry and programs.
And Dr. Cedric Bridgeforth, I know you want to weigh in on that and probably have an additional question that you want to ask Dr. Lyles. I think we have about a minute, 60 seconds.
Yeah, actually, I think Dr. Lyles covered that sufficiently. I would just like to ask Dr. Lyles about, what's a way you would encourage churches, leaders, groups, faith groups, to begin to have conversation amongst themselves about this asset-based or appreciative approach? Like what's a good question they can ask themselves to determine if they're ready to have that conversation?
I ask a question, and it's a very simple question. What is beautiful around your church? Because sometimes as we're going into our communities, we're so focused on going to the church building. We're there for 60 minutes, 90 minutes, and then we leave. So we have no clue of what is truly going on in our local communities. So a simple question, what is beautiful in the community around your congregation? And that will tell you if they are able to see what is truly around their community or what lens they're looking at their community through. If you're getting answers of, I don't see anything beautiful, we have dilapidated buildings, then you know that you have some work to do to help them see the assets in that local community. But if they can name, we have one of the oldest members of the community living 2 blocks down, or we are housing people who can give X, Y, and Z to our local community, then you know that people truly understand and can see the assets and potential in their local communities.